Buenos días, señoras y señores. A nombre de la CEPAL, sean bienvenidas y bienvenidos a la sala de conferencias Celso Hurtado. Les recordamos, por favor, silenciar sus teléfonos y tomar nota de que al finalizar la conferencia podrán hacer preguntas a través de la plataforma escaneando el código QR. Contamos hoy con la presencia de José Manuel Salazar-Xirinachs, Secretario Ejecutivo de la Comisión Económica para América Latina y el Caribe de las Naciones Unidas, la CEPAL, quien está acompañado por el señor Winston Dookeran, Secretario General de la Universidad de Euclid, quien esta mañana dará una conferencia magistral en el marco de los 75 años de la CEPAL, que se titula Estructura y Sinergia en el Desarrollo del Escenario del Caribe y su Damos la más cordial bienvenida al
Caribbean. We would like to welcome everyone who has joined us here today, representatives of the UN and of other international organizations, as well as colleagues from the programs, civil society representatives, academia, and the ECLAC staff that has joined us here today. We would like to also greet those of you who are joining us through our platforms. I would like to briefly mention that this conference, or Mr. Dookeran's conference, will be in English. We will have interpreting into Spanish, and you may follow the conference in both languages on the platforms as well. We will also have sign language. Without further ado, I'd like to offer the floor to Mr. Salazar, Executive Secretary of ECLAC.
Muy buenos días.
Good morning. I'd like to cordially greet you and welcome everyone present. Welcome to the authorities of the government of Chile, to representatives of the diplomatic corps, officers or officials of the UN system, ECLAC colleagues, and of course to all those of you who are accompanying us virtually. Friends,
The fifth keynote lecture in our cycle commemorating the 75th anniversary of CEPAL, ECLAC. These lectures have provided us with a space to celebrate the past contributions of these institutions, but also a space to reflect on the current and future challenges of the region and of ECLAC. Until February next year, we will hear the perspectives of eminent thinkers on a range of issues that will allow us to think afresh and revisit old and new challenges from new perspectives. Today, I am excited that we are focusing our attention on the Caribbean, a region that is integrated by 29 member states and associate members, many of which I have been privileged to work with quite intensely in previous professional responsibilities. The beauty and cultural vibrancy of this subregion are well known. Also, its complex and varied history as a magnet for voyages of discovery of many types. However, the Caribbean is as beautiful as it is vulnerable and fragile. Many Caribbean countries are characterized by significant multidimensional vulnerabilities that challenge their paths to long-term sustainable development. Small size is a classic vulnerability that has received a lot of attention in the development literature. And overcoming the disadvantages of smallness was precisely one of the motivations behind the creation of the Caribbean Community in 1973, that this year celebrates 50 years of integration efforts. And I know Mr. Dookeran has written arguing that size is not an issue, and maybe today we will be able to hear more about that point. Something that there is no doubt is a big issue for Caribbean countries is that they are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Due to climate-related disasters, many Caribbean countries have often had to take on expensive short-term loans for recovery and reconstruction, which undermine efforts to reduce rather high debt burdens. The high-risk perception of the Caribbean contributes to the high cost of borrowing from private lenders. However, many countries of the subregion also lack access to concessional financing because of allocation metrics in the global financial system based mainly on GDP per capita do not adequately consider the vulnerabilities that they face. So the region seems stuck in a cycle of disasters, recovery with low growth, loans, large deficits, and debt that challenge efforts to progress towards resilient and sustainable development. What gives me hope is that the Caribbean has not accepted the status quo and has not been deterred by its relatively small size. In fact, the subregion embodies the phrase, "In unity there is strength." Caribbean leaders have been united and particularly vocal in global fora on a number of calls, a call for greater efforts to address climate change and deliver climate justice, a call to seek support to address natural disaster effects, and a call to reform the global financial architecture to be fairer and more inclusive. Caribbean diplomats have been instrumental contributors to efforts to reimagine the global economic order. For example, through the Bridgetown Initiative led by the Prime Minister of Barbados, through the Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative of the Secretary-General of the United Nations and co-chaired by the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and the Lost and Damaged Fund, which was championed by the Alliance of Small Island States and secured under the chairmanship of Antigua and Barbuda during COP27. Antigua and Barbuda also co-chair a high-level panel of experts on defining a multidimensional vulnerability index. Further, the current president of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency Ambassador Denis Francis of Trinidad and Tobago, has also underscored the need to defend the cause of small island developing states, the SEEDs. Indeed, with the proliferation of ideas birthed in or championed by this subregion, it is no surprise that the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has made supporting SEEDs and Caribbean states in particular a priority during his tenure. Notably, he has integrated many subregional concerns into his recent proposal for increased SDG investment, climate action, and climate financing. Furthermore, he has joined the calls for a new Bretton Woods moment to redesign the global financial architecture to better reflect today's economic realities, vulnerabilities, and power relations. Next year, Antigua and Barbuda will host the 4th International Conference on SEEDs and will lead discussions towards a bold new program of action for SEEDs. This program will renew the mandate of support for SEEDs, not just for ECLAC, but for the wider international community, to support the priorities of the Secretary-General and to effectively deliver for all our member states. It is imperative that we are all well-informed and fully engaged in understanding the major challenges and priorities of Caribbean states. At ECLAC, we are honored to help elevate the Caribbean perspective and to contribute to sub-regional thinking and action on sustainable development. I can think of few Caribbean thought leaders well-placed to lead this discussion more than our speaker today, the Secretary-General of Euclid University and noted Trinidadian economist and politician Winston Dookeran. Welcome, Mr. Dookeran, to ECLAC, and thank you for accepting our invitation. I look forward to hearing you speak on the topic of your lecture today, Structure and Synergy in Development, Caribbean Setting and its Future. Before inviting you to address us, allow me to first share some information about your career and contributions to Caribbean development and development thinking. In the academic sphere, Mr. Winston Dookeran is a graduate of the University of Manitoba in Canada and the London School of Economics. He lectured at the University of the West Indies and at Toronto University and was fellow of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. Prior to his current role at the Euclid University, Mr. Dookeran had a distinguished public service career in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. From 1997 to 2002, he was the governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, where he initiated the process of upgrading financial supervision and regulation and revised the bank's monetary policy framework. He facilitated greater clarity in the bank's communication by introducing its overnight repurchase rate to provide a clear signal about the stance of monetary policy and by issuing the inaugural edition of its monetary policy report. He was active in national politics, serving briefly as political leader of the United National Congress before forming his own political party, the Congress of the People, both of which in coalition formed the government of Trinidad and Tobago between 2010 and 2015. During this period, he served as Minister of Finance and then as Minister of Foreign Affairs. For his distinguished service to the country in the field of economics, Mr. Dookeran was conferred the Order of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the nation's highest award. His passion for economic development extended well beyond the shores of the Twin Island Republic. A large part of his work was focused on unity and the importance of diplomacy and of Caribbean regional integration. At the national level, Winston was a member of the Executive Board of the Inter-American Development Bank and a governor of the Caribbean Development Bank. He has written quite extensively on the evolution of leadership and economic thinking in the Caribbean. In fact, I am pleased to announce that his new book, which is entitled Development and Diplomacy, Resetting Caribbean Policy Analysis in the Aftermath of the COVID-19 Pandemic, is being released this month by the University of the West Indies Press. We are privileged that Winston is a longtime friend and former employee of ECLAC, contributing his novel ideas to help ECLAC's thoughts on Caribbean development. His several books and many articles bear witness to his prolific thinking and writing. So, without further delay, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Winston Dookeran to deliver his keynote address as part of the lecture cycle commemorating the 75th anniversary of ECLAC.
Les recordamos que hay un número importante de personas.
We'd like to remind you that there are several people participating online from the Caribbean.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Salazar, for your kind invitation to be here and for your kind words of introduction. It's always great to be in this building and more specifically in this room, where it has so much that belongs to us. I myself have always felt that ECLAC is like a cradle of the ideas of development for us in the hemisphere, for us in the Caribbean too. It's perhaps the only institution today that has retained its core function on the ideas of development. It is done so in a turbulent time and a turbulent period, more so now than even in the past. And as I mentioned to the Executive Secretary in his gracious lunch he had with me yesterday, with my old friend, Mr. Perez, that ECLAC has stood firm as an institution of dignity. No wonder it has attracted so much goodwill, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but throughout the world. Why has it been so? It's because you have never, in my view, deviated from the search of what was and is the public good of development. There are many institutions that look at all aspects of development and become specialists in those aspects. But ECLAC has the unique ability and history of bringing it all together. What has been, in my view, the critical issue that has given ECLAC, this United Nations body, such a unique role? Because the sense of dignity with which you operate, the equidistance that you work with in all the varying political ideologies of our times, the search for new ways and the search for new approaches have made you an institution that is today recognized globally as perhaps in the institution on the ideas of development. So it is a great pleasure to be here on this occasion. And at a wonderful lunch I had with José Manuel Salazar, your Executive Secretary, and my old-time friend, Mr. Perez, yesterday. We talked about the complexity of development. And they responded by saying that that complexity of development is really a complexity of how do you form a consensus in order to move forward. And so many times when we write and we talk about the diagnostics. We sometimes talk about the prescription, but very rarely we move into the realm of working towards the complexity of consensus building. So I start my lecture here today with a caveat. The caveat is that I could shed little light on the complexities of consensus building. Myself, having been a part of that process over my years of service, not only is it an issue of complexity, but it's an issue of moving complexity. And that makes the search for the right ideas for development even more difficult. It is therefore in that context, therefore, that I looked at the Caribbean for today's lecture, and I realized that there are many Caribbeans, each with its distinct historical pathway, each with its own historical institutional setting, and each with its own development path and progress roadmaps. So it is difficult to find a consensus in this historical reality and geography of our place. What we find really is a set of contradictions. So it's really a study not of consensus as much as it is a study of contradictions. And how do we find out of this mesh of contradictory history and institutions and policy a consensus that can be able to further the cause of development? As I looked at some of the issues that brought us together, and I read what your executive secretary presented shortly after he assumed office here on his vision for this organization, it was clear to me that this lecture series which you've put together, which I am privileged and honored to be one of the lecturers, is specially designed in order to find a return to the traditional roots of structuralism. Structuralism has been the heart of the understanding of the Latin American story in the world of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and I dare say now. And as your executive secretary tried to open the door of the perimeters of the circles of development that is before us, he felt that the Caribbean region, now an integral part of the hemisphere of many Caribbeans, some of them on the mainland, will now have to relook and refresh their perspectives on that future. So I start by going back to what your distinguished leader, Raul Prebisch, in whose name this particular meeting room is taking place. When he provided the great insight that the unequal distribution and exchange in the global system was at the heart of the relationship between Latin America and the wider world. And out of that unequal distribution of the global system came so many insights, including his center-periphery thesis, which we all had to learn when we were students of economics. For it provided a frame to understand the relationship that have led to the problems that express itself in different ways in our respective and individual countries. We all know of Raul Prebisch, but subsequent executive secretaries were able to build on that. Build on that by looking at different dimensions of that unequal exchange between the region and the rest of the world. Enrique Iglesias, another one of the distinguished luminaries out of this institution and out of Latin America and out of the Caribbean and Latin America, championed the cause of integration as one way to find an immunity to that unequal exchange which has visited us through our own history and our own geography. And then much later on, your most recent secretary, executive secretary, Alicia Bassana, whom I had the privilege to work with. Focus largely on the issues of inequality and was able to argue persuasively, especially with small island states, that equality was one of the obstacles to the process of growth. She felt so strongly about it that when I retired from my official position in the government of the country of my birth, she offered me to come to Washington and join her wonderful staff to look at the Caribbean, both from afar as well as from within. And out of that came the beginnings of this lecture. It came out in a book that aptly says The Caribbean on the Edge, which was published just about a year ago by the University of Toronto Press. I think the word the Caribbean on the Edge could give you an idea of what I intend to say in this lecture today. But before I go into that, let me echo what Mr. Salazar said earlier about the Caribbean main characteristics that emanate out of the ECLAC original thinking, but took place independently and on its own. For in the aftermath of independence, a group of academics, mainly at the University of the West Indies, but including other universities in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, formed themselves in what is called the New World Group. And they were able to articulate a vision of this so-called unequal exchange between the region and the rest of the world. And they identified what has turned out to be, after voluminous pages on the subject, 3 critical features. Our Executive Secretary spoke about them today. The vulnerability issue. The vulnerability issue was a variable of fact. It was, in fact, an initial condition dictated by geography, dictated by history, and dictated by the environment. It's almost as if the vulnerability issue is a given in the challenge for development. But then came the issue of fragility. Many of the, what was called and what remains to be called the small islands of the region, and I'll see something about that later on, were seen as fragile institutions. And that sometimes the issue of size was seen as a limiting factor that reinforces the fragility of building economic development. Fragility, in my view, was a process variable. It was determined by institutions and by governance. And attempts to reduce the fragility of the Caribbean region were really attempts to improve the institutional framework for development and to introduce the system of governance that has been called good governance. And then the third particular feature of the Caribbean is one that we hear all the time and continue to hear, the resilience issue. Is it able to be resilient? Is it able to withstand the external shocks of the world around us? Is it able to live on its own 2 feet in this difficult world? So the 3 fundamental principles have remained principles that have kept the analytical entrepreneurs busy for many, many years. Vulnerability, fragility, and resilience. Some of the writers in those early days dealt with these issues squarely. William Demas, one of the most distinguished economists of our times, and in his book, The Economics of Small States, he was able to identify the limitations of size as well as the potential of size. And he came down essentially with the argument that for the Caribbean to respond to those challenges which I spoke about, endogenous growth in an enlarged economic space must be the strategic direction. And for many years, that had been the mantra. Then Arthur Lewis, distinguished Nobel laureate, born in St. Lucia, in his many writings on Caribbean and global development, made the most pertinent point that closing the gap between capability and opportunity is really the challenge for development. How do we do that? And Lloyd Best and Frank Rampersad wrote on the structure of Caribbean societies, and more specifically on the structure of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, which in some sense was not typical of the rest of the Caribbean at that time. And talk about the institutional limitations of the plantation economy, where the Caribbean, through the forces of history, became plantation economies. And therefore, the phrase, development cannot be imported, was a phrase that became very, very relevant to the post-independence period. But what did it mean when we say development cannot be imported? It did not mean that there was no need to negotiate with the world around us. What it meant is that when you do that, it must be done in the context of igniting development within. The technical people will refer to that as endogenous growth. And therefore, the entire strategy that was able to define the structuralism that was in place at the time was based on this concept that development could not be imported. The institutional limitations, be it the plantation economy, or be it any other facets of external bodies that were involved. Later, the World Bank and IMF will become the substitute for the plantation economy as the process of development grew. So it is in that context that I will share with you my thoughts on the structure and the synergy in development, with specific reference to the Caribbean setting and its future. And to do so, I hope I get this correct, I will ask a few questions just to guide us. Which one? That's the top. Okay, I'll try. What are the key questions that I will engage in this discussion and this dialogue today? How is the structure of the Caribbean economy changing from Prebish to Lewis to today? And as I answer that question, I then ask the more fundamental question: is the assumption of linearity in the growth models still relevant? Of course, what is relevant today is the recent visitations of the pandemic and other conflict that have affected Caribbean prospects. So what is the geometry of the pandemic crisis? And then, in response to what I said earlier about the large space, as we search for new policy options, how do we integrate convergence into the economic integration model, which was raised earlier by Iglesias to start with, and subsequently by all the Caribbean leaders, scholarly leaders. But in order to answer that, I come face to face with the question which I said is the caveat to my lecture. How do I build the consensus, the science of consensus, to move the Caribbean development forward? Incidentally, for me, that became an important point of departure in my own career. For I'd spent many years at the University of the West Indies and elsewhere as an academic, as one studying models, as one trying to understand equations. And after those many years, I sat back and I said to myself, but why is it not happening? To the extent that we wanted it to happen. We are schooled to think that we can measure development in terms of per capita income. We are schooled to believe that we can measure development in terms of static variables, whatever they are. But we were never schooled to define development in terms of closing the gap between opportunities and expectations, of which Lewis spoke about. So then I myself decided that I want to understand development a little better. So I entered the world of electoral politics. I make the distinction between electoral politics and politics, because we are all in politics at all times. We just use different platforms in order to exercise that profession. But electoral politics is getting the consent and permission of the people in order to move forward, and using the levers of political change to make it happen. So my next comment will be on what is the synergy between the logic of economics and the logic of politics in getting development right, as it pertains to my experience. We said earlier that development cannot be imported. And one of the most fascinating set of principles of development that were instituted by your own institution, the United Nations, was the SDGs. Last year I was invited here for the first time, and I think that's when I reacquainted a long relationship with your executive secretary. And when he hadn't seen me for years and said, well, why don't you come to this congress that he's having, focusing on the SDGs. And out of that came a lot of findings, and you have a lot of work that has been done at this very institution. But then I came across some issues which I'll speak about very briefly, because it's now widely recognized the SDGs are losing its targets in terms of time and in terms of quantity, as much as they remain important measurements of global development. A theory of change for SDGs implementation process. But beyond our own borders, and today more so than before, we are dealing with the new frontiers. Out of the pandemic, gave birth to the entire focus on the digital economy. Now it is used as one of the major strategic objectives of many economic strategies. But beyond that, we are about to enter a new phase with technologies like the AI technologies. And the Caribbean, while it cannot develop on its own, must be consistent with global developments in which it has no control, but on which it has, in which there is great impact on its own development. The frontiers ahead without disruption. But all this in the end has to come down to whether or not the people benefit. And I think this is what ECLAC thought process of focusing on development has always been, equality and issues of that nature. Would all this bring benefit to the people themselves? And how will it bring benefit to the people themselves? And more often than not, there's a need for a social contract. Social contract between all the various stakeholders, be they business, be they labor, be they academics, be they civil society groups, be they policy-oriented think tanks. Building a new social contract. Is it possible in the Caribbean? Or is it that we give a sense of comfort to the words without the substance? And now, an issue that is so much in the minds of our international advocates for Caribbean involvement. Prime Minister of Barbados, Mayor Motley, has been at the forefront of that charge. Is development finance working for Caribbean societies? I'll say a few words on that. That to me, that is the most critical issue that has to be addressed. Is it working for Caribbean societies? And then we come to the issue of the G20 and the G20 and the multilateral system that has been used since World War II and thereafter. The points of power and how do they link to the Caribbean? And whether those points of power are indeed relevant today. José, this morning, I asked him the question, is it fair for me to say that you are initiating a relook at the foundations of structuralism in development? And his response, not to my surprise, was, it is fair, but it is more than that. Structuralism is not the prerogative, he told me, of the developing world alone. It is now the prerogative of the developed world, which is an insight that we must not lose touch of it. Sometimes the best articles are written over coffee. I thank you for that insight. And finally, at the end of our lecture, and at the end of this series of lecture, I assume ECLAC would want to know, what do I do about it all? What do I as an institution do about it? How do I change? What are my priorities? So I will usher a few words on those priorities. So let me start very quickly by the strange thing about me, I talk about the new world, but I belong to the old world. So these things become very problematic for me. Right, I don't know if you're seeing it or able to read it. How is the structure of the Caribbean economy changing? I need some guidance on time, Mr. Chairman, appropriately. Okay. The framework to look at that was developed by a scholar, a German scholar, who spent his life in the University of the West Indies, just retired. He talked of the world information space, where economic borders are disappearing. I think he did that before the Ukraine war. And political sovereignty is being challenged. And he couldn't anticipate the situation in Israel now. But argued that a global mindset capable of complex thinking must be cultivated. And the key to the development challenge facing us is a strategy for structural change. Out of that has emerged a whole new area, which is engaging people all over, especially in China, in Europe, the circular economy. it is futuristic. But it is also converting the waste into a productive output. And much of that is happening by rudimentary ways in the past, and perhaps needs to be tackled more seriously in the future. Underlying all these, right, got it, is the assumption of linearity in the growth process. Is this still relevant? When we look at the analysis of growth as it applies to the region and perhaps beyond the region, we realize that it is based on what I call, or what we can call, a linear approach, a linear analysis. But essentially what we are studying is a non-linear process. So the methodology of a linear approach to development itself constricts the prescription in understanding a non-linear process. And by the word non-linear, I mean it is beyond a straight sense of logic, of equation logic. And therefore, as we begin to relook at the theories of growth, complex adaptive systems will appear to me to be the more appropriate framework for studying the issues of development. It has its own logic, but it has a wider frame. An index of complexity, which measures the productive potential and knowledge intensity of the economy, become the key factors that will push development forward. I believe one of your lecturers and former executive secretary, José Antonio Campo, argued that the key to a macroeconomic policy is what he calls a mix of counter-cyclical policies and a productive strategy for diversifying the production sector. So we might want to start by querying the premise and the assumption that is built in our study of growth models as to whether or not we can use a linear analysis to study effectively non-linear processes in today's world. How has the pandemic crisis affected our thinking? Well, I think it was peculiar in some ways because it introduced what I refer to as a loop-type cycle of shocks. There are many shocks. Shocks now must be studied in as many different dimensions. And this pandemic shock created a loop-type cycle of shocks. The pandemic induced a supply shock, which reduced wages and production, and in turn fueled a demand shock and a fall in purchasing power. So it was difficult to come out of that shock by traditional measures that are used in recessionary times. The response to that has been to look at the kinds of shocks in the traditional sense of V-shape or L-shape shocks. But what we found in the pandemic situation is that the external shock is amplified by endogenous shocks that cascades through the economy, particularly through the health sector and the well-being sector. And the need to emerge out of that loop-type cycle of shocks required major fiscal packages stimulus. This is not only for the region, it was more so for the world and for Europe. I remember it was Mr. Draghi, who was then the president of the European Bank, if I'm right, when asked, how much do you need to inject into the world? He said, whatever it takes, which reflects the loop-type cycle of shocks that came out of the pandemic. The after effects of that must be understood, because a shock, once it impacts on the economic system, generates a new structure. And the tendency to move to the new vision on the old methods is strong. So therefore, we will need to look back. Loop-type cycle of shocks between demand and supply. To what extent do they persist? And to what extent the incentives that operate in recessionary times to come out of that shock relevant? So these are some of the issues as we begin to understand the geometry of the pandemic crisis, as it affects us in the region, and I dare say, other countries in the world. But how do we really respond to this new reality, this new structural changes that are before us? How do we give credence to the thinking of Parrish and Arthur Lewis and others whom I mentioned earlier, who said the heart of structural change is at the source of development processes? Structural change are reflected through institutions, and many institutions emerged out of the early period of development. One such institution, as I mentioned, is the institution of integration, widening the economic space. But that too has found itself in a bit of some stalemates. While it has performed well in its limited role of widening the English-speaking Caribbean countries into a wider space, it has not been able to search for what I refer to as convergence spaces in economic development. Convergence spaces is about bringing the synergies that exist in the system together. Whether the convergence spaces could come through energy, or whether the convergence spaces could come through maritime transport, or whether the convergence spaces could come through, as far-fetched as it may sound, entering into the space economy of the world. At a conference that was held in Port of Spain in 2015, entitled The Future of the Caribbean, which was also supported by your institution, Mr. Secretary. At that time, Mr. Prado, one of your noted economists, for those of you who are in the audience, attended and made a wonderful presentation. But beyond that, the Trinidadian national who was now working in the space industry in Canada, in the United States, sorry, also made a strong plea for the Caribbean open itself to participation in the world space industry. I knew very little of it, but since she was, in fact, knowledgeable on the subject, it caught my ears. So convergent spaces really are the new way to add to the integration framework, to really widen its potential. And some of the issues I've raised are only the beginning of that process. There are two interested institutions that are on our doorstep today. One is the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, which is the smaller of the small islands got together and established its own currency board, as they call it, currency union. And it is a seamless trans-border policy framework in monetary management. It's a convergent space, limited, of course, to those groups, but have served them well in providing stability in foreign exchange management when the entire world and the rest of the world is yelling about the instability in that area. So it's not that we have not done it, it's just that we have not done enough of it. But specifically to introduce convergent spaces in the integration process will be an area of fertile research and positive policy responses. Another example of a wider frame is the Pacific Alliance, of which you know so much more about, which tends to increase competitiveness by integrating economies, allowing for the free flow of goods, capital, services, and people. So the search for convergent spaces is perhaps more relevant now as the means by which we could expand our economic space within the region. And in so doing, the old method of belonging to a body and feeling that you are in an integration grouping is over. The new method is belonging to a group of activities in which you are all working together. So we can explore that possibility. And in my view, the Association of Caribbean States is an important platform, perhaps the only Caribbean-owned global platform that could enter in the global diplomacy for that role that I have just identified. What is the synergy between the logic of economics and politics in getting development right? As I said earlier, getting development right is essentially an issue of governance, but it's also an issue of closing the gap between theory and practice. And that is why I believe these lectures are being put forward. How do you close the gap between theory and practice more fast? The next one. Right. Thank you. And therefore, I come now, and I think time may be against me, but I come now to the issue of defining the development space in growth models, the removal of institutional inertia, and most important, a change in role of the state. The time has come for resetting the state and market roles in the development process. In the region, the state and the paramountcy of the state became important. Then the free market became important. And the truth is, neither is as important as development, whether they bring development or not. So a new role of the state that is neither controlling nor facilitating must make that change happen. And for that, I propose not only in publication that I referred to earlier, but the one that your Executive Secretary referred to, a catalytic role of the state. So the time is fertile for some new approaches in thinking on handling the structural debate and finding the synergies in that debate for development. I'll briefly go through the SDGs. And at a very recent conference held in Saudi Arabia, which focused on the 17th SDGs, a theory of change to provide a catalyst for action that involves research, talent, development, governance and regulation, outreach and teaching was enunciated. It was a bold attempt. Not to look at spending more money in order to achieve more results, but in changing the way money is spent and the focus of that spend to change the results for the SDGs. Time will not allow me to go into that, but your report of your last conference held here in this very place outlined many steps in that direction. But most of those steps tend to be, let's spend more money to achieve the targets. The theory of change process that I have read about is let us alter the frame for the expenditure. The frontiers ahead beyond disruption, because every time there is a new technology, every time information begins to come into the development matrix, there could be disruption. So the key question about innovation, which is talked about a lot, is how to create new markets without destroying or disrupting existing ones. One of the historical challenges facing the Caribbean is how do we transform the age-old plantation economy of sugar and oil into a modern technology with high technological input and social equity at the base. That is, new markets without destroying or disrupting existing ones. Too often, governments faced with fiscal dilemmas of supporting sunset industries respond by getting rid of the entire industry in the name of fiscal prudence, but without replacing it with something that fills the gap, whether it be sugar, whether it be bananas, whether it be nutmeg, and therefore a strategy to retain and build upon without disruption is perhaps a new dimension to the extent that is possible. And the artificial intelligence is just on the corner. But instead of going through the motions of only doing seminars on it, perhaps it is time to look at the most critical battlegrounds on which the game would be played. Those battlegrounds have far-reaching consequences on the structure of economy through elements of data, computing power, talent, and institutions. But perhaps the most telling and the one that we can address with immediacy will be the institutions issue. And then, as I said earlier, the question of the social contract. Is it possible for the Caribbean? There's a well-known quote by a Nigerian poet, along with J.B. Butler, the English poet, things fall apart when the center cannot hold. You know it. Is there a way for a new social compact? A recent book written by the director of the LSC at that time was on that issue. Institutions for social security support that we have in the region, and I can say without fear of contradiction, are designed for another time and cannot work in this time. The role of institutions is powerful, and the market-driven approach providing new products for economic and social security of the population is now shifting to the framework for social contract for the region. In such a role, the old distinction and the old contradictions between private and public sectors must go away, but they must now work in harmony in order to create new institutions for social equity. The state cannot be relied upon alone to provide the funding for social security support. And once you recognize that, then the private sector and other sectors relevant to the issue of social equity must now design new instruments for so doing. Such instruments are multifaceted, but it involves many different dimensions, some unthinkable at this time, but some that are engaging the political climate actors in some of the advanced countries of the world, like guaranteed income. An example of that is that we have good national insurance schemes. They have reached the limit in sense of the size of their portfolios and the aging population ahead of us. And therefore, to simply look at that from an actuarial basis without a design basis is in fact a missed opportunity of our time. So let me come next to the issue of financing. And I said that development financing must work for Caribbean societies. This is an issue of high potency. International financial institutions have earmarked significant sums to the Caribbean countries over the years. The question is, do these funds create development? Initiatives aimed at reforming the multilateral development banks include the Capital Adequacy Report commissioned by the G20, the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact of June 2023, and the G20 Experts Group on Strengthening the MDCs. What is missing in these reports is the impact of these reforms on the borrowing countries' balance sheets. In other words, it's a reform for strengthening the MDCs, a capacity to extract funds. It is not a report for advancing the MDC's capacity to create dividends. What is missing, both in the reports and in the terms of reference? This calls for a flow of funds analysis between the MDCs and the national economies. And that has been argued at times, there is a net outflow of funds, given the rules of disbursement. The reform agenda on MDCs must be all embracing, not including the efficiency of the institution as a lender of funds, but also including the impact on the borrowing countries, its capital structure, and its absorptive capacity. And so as I come to the end of this lecture, I want to say two things. to bring it together. One is the issue of the global presence of the Caribbean. Diplomacy today, we know, is being challenged on many fronts. But in terms of the framework that affects us in the region, it is a shift from the old notion of multilateral order to a new notion of a multipolar order. That is a major intellectual shift and requires a major response by small countries. It is not a question of neutrality or non-alignment. As my good friend Jorge Hines have said in his most compelling book, which he has recently released for Latin America, calling for active non-alignment. It is a new approach to global relations and negotiation. Small states must now navigate webs of alliances, rivalries, and conflicting interests in a multipolar world. The intrinsic strength of small states through what has been referred to as microlateralism makes a compelling case for posturing of new power capabilities in today's international relations agenda. The G7 stand on economic coercion and harmful practices in their statement on economic resilience and economic security affects Caribbean small countries as they are susceptible to external pressures. A diplomatic initiative some years ago was undertaken to establish a Caribbean dialogue with the G20 working group. It met once, it met twice, it should meet again. And that will focus squarely on the issues of competitiveness. So, what does this all mean now in the context of some of the observations that were passed on to me by your Executive Secretary and by his Chief of Staff, Sylvia Hernandez? Could we shift the analytics for action? Could we, as an institution that has maintained its dignity as a development institution for ideas over these last 75 years, and will that dignity be retained by shifting now the analytics for action as it appears, as it affects the Caribbean region? And there are 6 particular areas in which I have identified as areas in which we can shift the analytics for action. How we do it is the caveat I mentioned earlier. But what we have to do is the substance of what I want to share with you. The first one, design an institutional frame to promote sustainable social equity. Sustainable social equity. Universal health coverage. Guaranteed minimum income for all. Robust and inclusive community governance. Put all together. But the operative word here is sustainable social equity. The second idea that emerges from the ideas that we have discussed so far is apply complexity and adaptive systems analysis for sustaining a growth momentum on an economy-wide basis. Go back to the drawing board. on designing growth models. The third area is understanding the loop-type cycle of shocks and creating buffers for financial immunity and shock absorbers in the workings of the economy. This requires intense international negotiations and should be part of the reform agenda of international financial institutions, as they are or as they will turn out to be. Fourthly, shift the integration model, limited by size, design, and inertia, to forge convergence spaces in production, institutional setting, and economic frontiers. And fifthly, learning the adaptive process for AI technology advance, preparing for AI, digitalization of the economy, and most important, measures to promote tactical change in small and medium-sized enterprises. And finally, as a catch-all phrase, review the role of the state to include a catalytic approach to enterprise engineering, financial innovations, and economy-wide structural change. Incidentally, on the last occasion, I was gracefully invited to come to this very audience, but its very place, I should say, a different audience. I spoke then, and I think you were kind enough to publish it, on the convergence space in integration, which align these issues that I have spoken about here on financial immunity and shock absorbers. Much of what I have said cannot be done alone, and obviously will not be done by researchers alone. But the researchers have the most important role to shape the argument for the future, if not to see the results of the fruits of that argument. And it is in this context I am delighted to come back to this institution that has always been an institution that has been true to its own dignity, as perhaps the only institution in the world of the Western Hemisphere that has remained truthful to the mission of the search for new ideas for development. It is in that context that I have outlined to you what has been my research, and I end by saying a word of gratitude. Someone on the plane asked me what I was going to do in Santiago. Why so far away? And I said to this person, who incidentally was from CAF, who was traveling to another meeting. And I told her, well, I can't answer you except I can say that there are two institutions which I consider the cradle on which I grew. One was the University of the West Indies, where I taught for many years and continue to be there in different capacities. But the other one of greater significance, because it made me focus on what I really wanted to focus on, development, was the Economic Commission for Latin America in Santiago. I say it again, that you have been able to provide insights, not only to me, but to others. And you are really embarking on another phase after the 75 years. We don't know where it's going to be or what it will be. But what we do know, it will not be what it has been in the past. It will be something yet uncharted. So I welcome this opportunity to come back to the cradle of this institution of dignity, this cradle of the ideas of development, and to share some thoughts on the Caribbean setting and its future, for your pondering and thinking, and perhaps for your own action. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Can we help you? Help you?
Yeah, sure. Let's put it all together. I don't lose it. Let's repeat this. Yeah. You come there.
Well, thank you so very much, Mr. Dookeran, for that professorial lecture full of wisdom, experience, full of knowledge about economic history, certainly about the Caribbean, about economic theory, and also, you know, through the prism of your vast experience in public policy from different positions. It is in a way difficult to, you know, we're now going to ask you some questions. We have around 20 minutes for that. But if I may use a couple of minutes just to react to a few things, because I think all the audience here and connected will agree that, I mean, you've covered a lot of ground. I think one of the things that I found extremely interesting is you went back to basics in some parts, on some very basic concepts. Like, for instance, this issue of linearity or non-linearity or complexity, the kind of development theory that we should apply in this complex world. That's crucial. But I think I would like to go through the list of how to shift from analytics to action, because that's something that we're trying to do in ECLAC now. Not that we haven't been in action in the past, but I think, you know, the rethinking about what needs to be done now with all the changes in the world is really a big challenge. And we want to, you know, see ourselves. And by the way, thank you very much for your concepts. In that answering your, you know, to the question in the plane by the CAF colleague, what you were going to come and do here? Well, you've done a lot of things, but one of the things is you came to make us feel good and to challenge us about what we need to do in the future by calling us the cradle on which you grew. And actually, we know it is true because it's the cradle on which I myself grew and many economists in Latin America. And I think it's important for you, particularly for younger colleagues, to hear that. And by calling us an institution of dignity, which I think is a deep concept that really can, not just to make us feel good, but I think the trust that this institution has in many sectors and policymakers in Latin America, it is because of that, and that is because of a certain style of interacting, a certain style of thinking, and of making policy recommendations. Anyway, you said in your first point, this issue of designing institutional frameworks to promote sustainable social equity, etc., and the idea that development is all about governance. We have been emphasizing that a lot, and this is one of the transformations that we're talking about, and we're taking this to practice in the sense of more systematically analyzing the governance and institutional capacities and weaknesses. And one example, very good one, is in our last meeting of ministers of social policy. Our position document was precisely on the institutions for social policy and the governance of social policies. And we're going to try and focus more systematically. Of course, that is also a central issue on which ILPES works, and the colleagues from ILPES, the Institute here in ECLAC. The second point you mentioned is this one about applying complexity and adaptive system analysis for sustaining growth momentum. That one, I think, it raises a lot of questions. I don't want to enter now because I myself am not very, I mean, I'm clear that it is not linear, that we live in a world of complexity. But what exactly it means to apply complexity and adaptive analysis for development and for analysis, that I leave it for, and I think you leave us a big challenge there, but an important one. The third, you say understanding the loop type cycle of shocks and creating buffers for financial immunity and shock absorbers, etc. I think that's another very deep point. Thank you for putting it in your list of 6 analytics to action, because we are talking about the cascade of crises, right, and shocks. And you mentioned, by the way, the famous Mario Draghi phrase about whatever it takes, doing whatever it takes. The problem is after all this cascade of shocks, even if governments in Latin America, or at least in many countries, would like to do whatever it takes, they can't, because the fiscal phase is very reduced. So if we keep being hit by more shocks, even if there is a disposition from policymakers to do whatever it takes, but the financing is not there, and there are other restrictions. So I think it's, this is very wise of you at this recommendation, but I think this point of creating buffers, of having the shock absorbers, which is not just the money, but the reaction capacity, is a major issue for Latin American countries. So thanks for that. The fourth point is the shift in the integration model. And you have this vision about spaces and so on. I think there's a question about that. But I think it's extremely important. And I think the big question here, that I will do, I'll come back to that because several colleagues, have asked about that, is if the Caribbean has been doing economic integration for 50 years, and you have the single market economy, and you have CARICOM, and yet I don't know if that's a harsh debate, but it seems that this economic integration process is a little bit paralyzed, or at least far from expectation. So maybe that would be, the first question, and it's reading, repeating what some colleagues here have, or also people listening. I will ask you to give us some thoughts about what more do you think, if this integration process is found wanting, what more needs to be done in the Caribbean? And why is it not, not enough is happening? But just to complete your list, learning and adapting process for the artificial intelligence, I think it's very visionary of you to put this artificial intelligence issue here on all the digital transformation, digitalization, measures to promote technical change, SMEs. I know Marco Ginás and his colleagues are very thrilled that they see, this point, and certainly many colleagues, because we are working very strongly on certainly digital transformation, but the new, super new element of digital transformation is artificial intelligence and its implications and potential. And finally, the role of the state, which is, a classic topic, which is crucial and goes back to the processes and so on. So, first question, what are the reasons for the lack of enough progress, despite the emphasis, the attention, the committees, and the institutions in the Caribbean, including CARICOM and the single market economy? What else do you think needs to be done in very pragmatic terms?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that very succinct and quick summary of some of the issues, particularly with respect to the last slide. I said to myself, I wanted to show the first slide and the last slide. So you're able to help me in the second objective. Thank you. I couldn't answer all the questions. We have a time limit here. But the one you raised, which you said you need to look at a little more closely, and you were kind enough to introduce the new book that is now being released as we talk here. UV Press is now releasing it. They sent me this notification last night. So you are the first group that I am sharing this information with. And this book is called Resetting Caribbean Policy Analysis in the Aftermath of COVID-19 Pandemic. And there is in that book a chapter on the issue of complexity in development, the methodology of complexity in development. Not written by me, it was written by a very young scholar at the University of the West Indies, whom I encouraged to do it. And I think it is worth reading to see how you can diversify the economy in the context of the new method of analysis. I don't know, but to answer that question, I don't know enough about it myself, but I am going on the basis of this young scholar who had written this paper, and it's in this book. Yes, the question of how do we move forward on some of these issues, I think there is a missing link between the research-oriented, policy-oriented bodies and the action-oriented, more often not political bodies. And that missing link is what I call, for want of a better word, a policy dialogue in a structured way. And that policy dialogue will be able to bring to the platform of the political people the issues that are of matter to them, not the advocacy of the ills of the society, which is the basis upon which they get elected, but the issues of solving the development issue, which is the basis on which they will always be elected. And a simple issue like that in the political culture of our societies, and certainly in the Caribbean, will enter a new debate. And I say that because as a former politician, I used to long for people to come to me to tell me what is the platform, rather than to leave it upon me to go and talk to the people about the platform I hear about or I read about. And I think that missing link in the scheme of things could be worked on. Whether you do it alone or whether you do it with other institutions like the UNDP and the University of the West Indies and CAF and others, it's a separate issue. But I think that might help to move the analytics into action as an intermediary step. With respect to the other issues, I'm very happy that you agree with the immunity argument, that is to say, creating buffers. And you need international negotiation for that. So that you don't have to run to the savior who imposes conditionalities for you to be saved in order to bring you into a lower level of exposure. So you have buffers. I'll give you a practical example of that. And this is something, I'm just saying from my experience now, because you want me to share my experience. Faced with that problem and faced with the oil situation in Trinidad and Tobago, I had engineered and got agreed by the then government, while I was in the central bank, the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund. We call it Civilization and Heritage Fund. And we found a formula to push money into that fund. And today, in the last 10 years, that fund has been the greatest support to the government's credit rating. When things went down, and especially after pandemic, and even before pandemic, because there's the financial crisis of 2008, that fund helped. That's the kind of buffer that we put. It was not large enough. It was not given enough time. It was meant to reach 100% of GDP. It only reached about 25% of GDP. But these kind of institutions. Now that was done locally. If that could have been done with in association with the World Bank, bigger people, for them these are small money. And therefore you could build something on a longer term basis. You could give an immunity against external shocks. Because shocks is something we face all the time. And I think the 2 points coming out of your comment to me over tea Structuralism is no longer a developing country problem. Shocks is no longer a developing country's problem either. So we got to redefine structuralism and shocks in a global context. And then we'll get all these institutions to adjust this lending and policies to suit. That is a big job, but who will do it?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that's a very important point that we should discuss more among ourselves here, in ECLAC, certainly because, with all the changes that you described, in the world, frankly, developed countries have a lot of structural problems themselves, migration, loss of, productivity growth, very slow. So even some of the leading countries now are getting, slow productive transformation, major, other gaps. So in a way, development theory in the tradition of ECLAC and so on, and of the big economists thinking about development was very much about how developing countries, poor countries, etc., could catch up. But now, for many developed countries, is how can developed countries maintain a level of living and not reduce the standard of living of the middle class and so on. So anyway, that's what I have. Another question here from Hector Azael about planning and the role of economic and social planning, which of course, he points out is a main idea of ECLAC since the beginning, and there's been a whole cycle about planning. And the question is, what's happening with that in the Caribbean? And I would perhaps add, to link with your idea of dialogues, what kind of planning is enough planning being done? Is there prospective, long-term view, foresight in Caribbean countries, or that's an area of weakness?
Strange enough, I think it was in the end of the first oil boom when Trinidad and Tobago had excess funds and were trying to satisfy all the latent demands of society. The then Prime Minister said that planning has lost its magic. Now, we have never recovered from that, because what has happened is day-to-day macroeconomic management has given precedence over any planning. And although the institutions of planning remain in place, their mission has been changed to be recording bodies rather than generating planning perspectives. And I think since that day, this was around the middle 80s, because there's a first 5-year plan, there's a second 5-year plan, there's a third 5-year plan, and things were moving in accordance to that. There was never a fourth 5-year plan. There was never a fifth 5-year plan. And many 5 years have passed since. I talk about Trinidad and Tobago. I rather suspect that this is the same in the rest of the Caribbean. That you find a situation now that planning in the formal sense of the word has been given second place. At ELPES, which was one of your institutions, I think located in Bolivia, was trying to encourage planning as an institution. But I sense what has happened is that planning has lost its mystique because events of the day and solving the problems of the day became more important than fundamentally changing the structure of the countries. And the political demands became greater than the economic demand. So you have to redefine planning now in the context of solving today's problem. And that is why in the 6 points I raised, I was very conscious of not putting any work to the poor planners anymore, but putting an objective in which will require planning, which will be more palatable than planning itself. But it's a good issue, good insight.
Thank you very much. And that gives me a foot to say that I think you're absolutely right. And the problem, and I think many writers have said that the conversation in the last few years, in the last decade in Latin America, or even more, has become very macroeconomic. and we've lost, the conversation to talk more micro issues, talking about productive development, but also about all the rest of the agenda. And I think, it's important to balance, because the problem is the governance. And this links up with the governance of international institutions, because, of course, ministers of finance, by definition, are mostly managing the short-term emergencies and so on. And if they are the governors of multilateral banks, World Bank and IMF and so on, then that becomes, economics is reduced to that. But what about the economics of structural change? What are the economics of long-term change? And that's where planning comes. So I think that again is an important insight and point that we, in ECLAC, which have always have a very balanced view of these things, should make more clear. I'm going to make you the last question because it's 1 o'clock already. There are a lot of questions that we won't be able to go through. We have around 20 questions here, but we will share with you. So at least you see how
I would love to get those questions in writing in due course.
We will provide them. We will provide them. But my question is about the issue that it's in your lecture, in your paper, but there has been no time to talk much about it, which is diplomacy. And the idea, which is, I think, very powerful in your lecture, that the small states can actually hit above their belt, and the smallness doesn't necessarily mean a little influence in global affairs and global efforts, and that they can have an important role. And now, since we live in this world where so much we need to strengthen multilateralism and global public goods and so on, please tell us more about what is your vision in terms of how small states can have strong influence, or perhaps if there are examples of where that has happened, and whether the Caribbean is actually making the most of this potential, or whether you find it wanting. And if it's found wanting in your candid assessment, what else should the Caribbean do that is not doing now to have more influence in international fora?
Well, I did mention in my lecture, it was not in my paper, but I did mention in the lecture, that the Association of Caribbean States is a platform, perhaps the only Caribbean platform of a global nature, has a global reach in political and diplomatic terms. I don't think that point has been acknowledged and recognized with Caribbean governments. And it is left to flounder for the last 25 years without a clear diplomatic and political mission. So it has ended up repeating the missions of other bodies of an economic and logistics nature, but that is not the main area of activity. So the first area that is lacking is to get a global institution that is Caribbean owned. And I'm using the word Caribbean in the wider Caribbean sense, because the ACS is the wider Caribbean. And let that become the focal point for interfering in the discussions and negotiations that are taking place at multiple levels in multiple places. CARICOM is not an economic, political, and diplomatic institution. CARICOM is an economic institution, and as such, it can deal with economic tactical issues and could be part of that. But to rely on CARICOM to be the spokesperson and the Council for Foreign Affairs, the Council of Ministers of Foreign Affairs, which is serviced by CARICOM, doesn't work, because the Council for Foreign Affairs doesn't have a political and global agenda before it. It has an economic agenda given by CARICOM. So I think my feeling is that the ACS should be given what it was supposed to be. It set up 25 years ago. It just came out of a report called Time for Action, in which the idea of the ACS having a larger diplomatic space to work with. Now, we need to fill into that agenda a number of the issues we talk about here in terms of negotiation with the IMF, negotiation with the World Bank, or whatever they are. So answer your question both ways, that in a sense that there is lacking an institutional frame to promote the global perspective of the Caribbean in a diplomatic channel. That institution is there, but Caribbean governments, in my view, themselves have not seen it that way. But I came from the time when that was established, way back when. Sridhar Ramphal, well-known Caribbean statesman, was the chairman of the group that did this Time for Action. So I was aware of the intent of this group, of this study that was done. So it was always in my mind, why don't we use it? So to answer your question, now, secondly, there are some recent publications, not from the Caribbean, but from outside the Caribbean on small states' role in global affairs, both from the University of Malta and from Singapore. I made reference to them in the paper, in which they outlined the different forms of diplomatic initiatives that small states should take. And the Foreign Affairs newspaper, Foreign Affairs Journal, wrote a very interesting piece on microlateralism, which means getting the synergy of small states together to speak with one voice on a common issue. Now, I know that's in the world of politics, but you got to, and diplomacy. But I think you have two things going on. You have the institution in the Caribbean that needs to be given its mandate, and so accepted by the governments. The mandate is there to be taken, but the governments have not viewed the institution that way. So the institution, obviously, the institution cannot go beyond the interpretation of the government of itself. And secondly, I this growing literature that is happening now on the role of small states, the agility of small states, the ability not to be feared, the ability to become a broker in conflict situations, these are all issues that are raised as the role of the small state. No one will fear it. They are agile. They operate on certain basic human principles. To some extent, they're the best safeguard of the principles that give support to the international economic order, the multilateralism concept. Yeah. Because small states rely on the multilateralism as their instrument for global involvement. But now they have to redefine it in the multipolar world.
Well, thank you very much. We can see the broad experience now. The former Minister of Foreign Relations speaking about global issues, and before to other questions, the former presidents of the central bank, et cetera, et cetera. So that means experience is so important, particularly from someone who permanently has been so curious intellectually and so in touch with analytics, economic and social and political and history and so on. A big applause, please, for Mr. Dookeran. Thank you very much.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. It has been our privilege to have you here, and we will invite you and maintain you close to our discussions about Latin America and the Caribbean and global issues. Bueno, mi agradecimiento y el de mis colegas en CEPAL a todas las personas que nos acompañan presencialmente y en plataformas digitales. Les recuerdo que hasta febrero del 24 cada mes están invitados a una o dos conferencias magistrales, donde les esperamos muy cordialmente. El programa del ciclo de conferencias está en la página web de la CEPAL para que reserven y vean las fechas. El 14 de noviembre tendremos el honor de escuchar la conferencia magistral de Adela Cortina, una catedrática de Ética y Filosofía Política de la Universidad de Valencia, y les esperamos nuevamente en esa ocasión. Muchísimas gracias y hasta la próxima.
agua y bocadillos afuera. Perdón, y para los que todavía están acá, tenemos la pre-lecture este lunes por Rebeca Ginspan. No le mencioné porque son dos actividades diferentes, ¿verdad? El ciclo de conferencias del 75 aniversario, pero la pre-lecture es